It's just probably true. All right, so the fact remains is that these things, while they are monopolies, technically they are regulated by the government. All price changes must be okayed from the government before they're allowed. And really what they're supposed to do is to come in with a cost analysis that says, here's what the price is. You guaranteed me when I bought the monopoly rights from you that I would make this much money on my cost, and I'm not if the price doesn't go up by 3% or 8% or whatever they ask for. No, I mean, it literally goes like that. Yeah, I mean, and that's why and again, this is also why when you look at these cost pieces of paper that these electrical companies bring in, most of the time, if you're a reputable business, when you look at the lines of costs and say some of these they're baloney. Take these ones. Right, exactly. I mean, technically, one of the things that why would a monopoly need to advertise? I mean, Alliant Energy folks, they spend probably around $10 million a month on advertising. What the hell are they doing advertising to us for $10 million? I mean, it's not like we can go ask somebody else to give us electricity, right? Yeah, basically, it's their way of making their cost structure go up and then being able to say, oh, we need to charge a little bit more, right? And then what do they do next month? Well, they cut their advertising expenditures in half, but do they lower their price by that amount? Oh, geez. All right, so normally what I would like you guys to do, if you can think about it over the next year, is watch when you find advertisements for these sorts of industries. And then look for when they all of a sudden stop happening. I mean, this is hard to do, right? Because we get inundated with so much frickin' advertising. I mean, it's ridiculous. But this is very cyclical, right? MG&E up in Madison, they advertise, basically January to March. And that's because March is when they have to submit their cost structures to the city and ask for rate increases. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's like, oh, geez, I wonder why all the advertising happens then. If you think about it for a second, it's not very hard to understand. But, I mean, again, they're doing exactly what we want them to do, right? Because remember, as a business, what's their goal? Money, right? You guys don't mean jack shit to them. I'm sorry, but you are just numbers, right? You're a street address that has a bill associated to it, and they want to be able to charge you as much as they can. So they're doing what we want them to do. In fact, we're electing officials who are, encouraging them to do exactly what we want them to do, in theory. Okay, anyways, they are price setters. So, I did demand next?
Yes.
Okay. So, what does their demand schedule, what does their demand curve look like? An individual firm, right? So remember, here was our perfect competition. Here's the perfect competition. We had to have two graphs, right? We had to have the overall, and we had to have the individual. In monopoly, do we need both of those? Why not? Isn't there an overall and an individual? So at least the nice thing about monopolies, just one graph. Yay! Okay, so the monopoly, the overall and the individual are exactly the same. The problem, though, is what kind of demand curve do they have now? Is it flat? No, it's not quite that nice. Unfortunately, it's just regular old downward sloping demand curve. If it were perfectly inelastic, then we would be able to tackle it easy. Unfortunately, it's not. We could fake it, try and pretend like it wasn't, but then I'd be lying to you. I try not to do that as much as possible. All right, so unfortunately, demand goes back to being good old downward sloping. When our demand curve was nice and flat, we had this wonderful relationship that made our lives beautifully easy. Oh, sigh. And this is where we have to pay for only having one graph, because now marginal revenue is not something nice and easy. Okay, so how we get marginal revenue. I am going to show you how we get marginal revenue. You are going to, in homework, do one of these examples to prove to yourself that I'm not lying to you. But I am going to show you how you get marginal revenue. And I'm going to make this very easy so that it's not overly complicated. So when you make your demand line, please make it connected to the price line, make it nice and straight, and make it just a little bit on the steep side. It doesn't have to be super steep, but steep enough, okay? So this is our demand in our monopoly. Marginal revenue is always related to demand, because that's what's measuring our revenue. Now, the way you get marginal revenue, and this is where it goes funky, is that this thing, if you had ever taken a geometry class, you would know that that was called an angle. Well, it is. And what I want you to do with that angle to generate the marginal revenue is to bisect it. What do you think bisect means? Cut it in half. Bi meaning two, sect meaning a section, cut it into two sections, hence cut it in half. That's all you have to do. So here's your angle. Figure out what the degrees are, cut the degrees in half. That will be your marginal revenue. As long as your demand line is straight, which again is never really true, but we're going to assume it is for this class, you can generate your marginal revenue by just bisecting the angle that demand curve makes. Now, the key to this, the reason why this, so what we're doing here is we're proving, or I'm showing to you, that at any quantity, the marginal revenue is always less than the demand. And remember that demand always sets the price, right? So what I'm telling you is that whatever we set the price at, marginal revenue is going to be less than it. And the reason why is that in a monopoly, if you raise the price, what do people do? They don't buy it as much, right? I mean, if electricity all of a sudden costs you $10 a kilowatt hour instead of 1.5 cents, that's absolutely right. We would hardly ever turn the lights on, right? I mean, we would start learning how to read in candles. But, you know, we would still use electricity every now and then, just very rarely. Similar with water and sewer. If it cost us $10 to flush the toilet instead of 5 cents, what might we do? Okay, again, don't think about it, but the concept is there. And so what happens is that as they lower the price, what happens to the amount of production going on? It keeps increasing and increasing. So there's this give and take when you have a real demand curve. If you lower the price, you have to produce more. So you'll sell more, but you also have to produce more, which kind of sucks. If you raise the price, that's great. You won't produce as much, but you won't sell as much either. So finding that spot where you maximize profit, it's a bit of a dance, all right? But the nice part about it is that because of this marginal revenue curve, we now can do it relatively easily. So in this curve, let's now add some cost to it. You guys know what cost looks like. So let's, here's your average total cost. Here's your average variable cost. And then here's your marginal cost. Again, your marginal cost should go through those minimum points of average total and average variable. What does a company have to do to profit maximize? What did we say for a perfect competition? Number 6 will always be the same for every market structure. It's always where marginal revenue hits marginal cost. Always, period. There's a little trick to this one, though, because now marginal revenue is this dashed line. So here's marginal cost, here's marginal revenue, whammo. That's where they hit. Please note that where marginal revenue and marginal cost hit, this is the production that they are going to produce. Okay? All it's doing is setting the quantity. It sets the quantity. To get the price, you always have to go to demand. Please note that we are not on the demand curve right now. We are on the marginal revenue curve. Standard student mistake is to say, this is the price. If this were the price, folks, note that it's below the average variable cost curve. This monopoly would be losing money. That's utterly silly, okay? At this quantity, take the quantity all the way up to the demand curve. That is your profit maximizing price, okay? And note, that's your profit. So, one more time. The profit maximization is still the same. It's marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That song you can sing forever and a day. Okay? The only difference is that in a monopoly, where those two hit, that sets the quantity. Okay? So it sets Q. To get the price, though, you got to get back to the demand curve, which it, unfortunately, right, in a monopoly, demand and marginal revenue are not the same. In a perfect competition, they were, and that's why it was easier. Unfortunately, for a monopoly, it's not. So at that quantity, go all the way up until you hit the demand curve. That will be your price. Okay? All right, so can profit exist in a monopoly forever? Why? Exactly. In order to lose profit, this monopoly would have to get competition. If this monopoly got competition, the number of sellers would not be 1, it would be 2. 2 would not be 1. This would not be a monopoly, okay? So the nice part about it is that profit in the long run, yes. And of course, this is why everybody and their mother is trying to start a business that is a monopoly, right? Because you get to dictate the quantity, and because you dictate the quantity, you dictate the price, okay? This is one of those things that people seem to think that this price is going to be the same no matter what quantity is produced. Okay? It's not how it works. In order to guarantee that prices are higher, producers must cut production, because otherwise they're going to have surpluses. If they've got a bunch of surplus, what do they got to do? They got to have a sale, in which case the price has to go down. Okay. So, again, one more time. It's not the seller who sets the price, it's the seller who sets the quantity. And by setting the quantity, restricting the quantity, making sure that there's not enough out there, they can raise the price, or the price goes up. All right. So, the key here, right, is noticing that monopolies will almost always restrict their production, period. So, how efficient are these guys? Are they attempting to find the most efficient way to produce their product? No. In fact, they're trying to find the most inefficient way to produce their product, because then they can pay themselves exorbitant salaries and still say, well, you know, I need to get paid $10 million a year, and so the cost of electricity should be 2 cents a kilowatt hour instead of 1.5 cents. Because, I mean, I deserve $10 million a year because I'm running a monopoly for you. And if I didn't run it, there would be no electricity. And what would happen to your people? I mean, doesn't that sound like a great argument? I mean, if you were on the city council and I was Alliant Energy coming in to say I need to charge 2 cents a kilowatt hour instead of 1.5 cents, you're going to be like, what? Okay, this is why you need to know this stuff, because one of you is going to be elected to your city council. One of you will be, sometime in your future. And if you don't stand up to these people and demand to see proper cost analysis, you will have to say yes every time they ask for a a rate hike. And it's literally done by the city council. I mean, think about the people that get voted in as a city council. I mean, they're not the brightest in the box, okay? So this is why you guys need to know, because you can talk to those people. I mean, I talk to my city council person lives 3 doors down from me, right? I'm constantly talking to her all the time. Of course, she's this wacko New York liberal who's even crazier than I am. But I can still have economic conversations with her and point out that, look, this is the sort of thing that if they come in and demand this, you come back with cost structure analysis, right? And they actually hired an economist now who does this for the city of Madison every time the MG&E comes in, so that we can get a proper analysis. I'm like, kick ass, right? So, efficient? No. They are essentially the worst. They are the least efficient market structure you can possibly have. Their goal is not to find this minimum point at all, right? That would suck for them, because there's no economic profit there. Right? The whole point of not having a perfect competition is having the chance for economic profit in the long run, and that's what they want. All right. That is really about all there is to the graphing side of a monopoly. Now, what I would like to talk a little bit about is how monopolies come about to play. So, types of monopolies. All right, so we just talked about one of them, right? Where do these monopolies come from? Government, right? Please note that all of these monopolies, right? Alliant, MG&E, you know, the gas and water sewer people, all of these people have to purchase the right to be a monopoly from the city council. They actually have to pay to be the monopolist. Okay, so there is a little give before there's an infinite amount of take first, okay? So they have to give the city a certain amount of money to say, from this point on, I can continually rape and pillage all the people in your city. I mean, essentially, right? So it's sort of, so it's at least a monetary transaction before you are serviced by these people. Don't think about what that means in a legal sense, right? But the idea, though, is that the government sets these up. And these are not bad. We really want them to exist. Because if we had multiple companies providing electricity and multiple companies sewer, again, we would have a mess when it comes to power lines and water pipes and sewer pipes underneath the ground. So I bitch about it and I moan about it, but in the end, okay, I would just like these people to be a little bit more towards the efficient side of things, right? Instead of, the whole rape and pillage side of things, right? But we get what we ask for. Now, there are other types of monopolies that happen. And these are called natural monopolies. Natural monopolies, this company, you may not know, but they used to have a monopoly, Alcoa. Alcoa used to be the only producer of aluminum in the world. So when aluminum was discovered as an element, everybody's like, oh wow, here's a new metal, it's aluminum, it's nice. All the people sort of, the chemistry people, they're like, cool, here's its structure, here's how many atoms it has, blah, blah, blah. No one really discovered how to make the material aluminum so it was this nice, brittle, and slightly powerful steel component. A substitute for steel, right? The thing with steel is that it's good, it's really strong, but it's also really heavy. And aluminum, nice and light, right? So if you have to ship something that's in a container and you have to pay based on the weight of what you're shipping, you would much rather have aluminum than you would steel, all right? So what Alcoa discovered was that in order to make the material aluminum from the element aluminum, aluminum as an element is available throughout the world. You can find it anywhere for the most part. But in order to create the material aluminum that goes into all of our steel-type products, you need this mineral, bauxite. Bauxite for 20 years, there were only 2 mines for bauxite in the entire world, and they were in Colorado. And they were owned by this really small company called Alcoa. They were small. But they were the ones who found the metal, found this material that scientists were synthesizing initially, right? So they were making aluminum. They could make aluminum for a long time back in the 30s and 40s, and actually we used it quite regularly in the war. They were making guns out of aluminum, but to produce it, they had to synthesize it so that it was fake. And what Alcoa discovered was that this could be owned and produced much cheaper than the synthetic means that the U.S. government was using. And so what they discovered was a cheap way to make aluminum. And so they were the only ones who got to produce aluminum. Oh, Alcoa was swimming in money for 20 years. From the mid-'60s to the mid-'80s, to God, they wore suits of $100 bills. Because think about it, right? Everything was made out of aluminum. They were the only bastards selling it because they were the only ones who could make it. Nobody else could find a bauxite mine, right? It wasn't until the mid to late 80s that China actually found some bauxite mines, that Taiwan had a couple, and so did Japan, right? Because they were in foothills. And so they went up into the Himalayas and they found a couple of bauxite mines, competition. And then once you get competition, what happens? And the problem with Alcoa, right, is that when you're a monopoly, are you trying to be efficient? No. You swim around in your swimming pool full of money, and and if you happen to accidentally, flush a few hundred bills down the toilet, it's no big deal, right? You can go make a couple really fast. So what Alcoa did between the 80s and 90s and really even the early 2000s was suffered heavily and refigured out how to finally become efficient. They've actually gotten to that point now where they're almost an efficient producer of aluminum and other products. They diversified as well. But they had the only one for a certain while, right? It was a company for a while. But again, the reason they were great was that it turned out they were the only ones who could make aluminum, all right? Nasty. Can you think of any other companies that are like this? Where they're the only ones who get to make it for a certain amount of time and then other people get to finally make generics of it? Pharmacies. Yeah, pharmaceuticals, right? And again, they buy a patent that says I get to be the only maker of this drug for 10 years plus a potential 5-year extension. Right? So the people who made aspirin, I mean, it used to be that there was no generic aspirin, right? There was no such thing as acetaminophen. You had to buy aspirin, which was made by the company who had the patent for aspirin. 15 years of that company making some serious money. Oh yeah, I mean, it's all over the place now. Yeah, all the different, the different high blood pressure drugs, all the different HIV drugs, all of the different, I mean, you name it. If there's a disease out for it, there's a drug for it, and there's a company with a patent who's trying to utilize it, period. Okay? I mean, male enhancement. Hello. Welcome to the monopoly. Okay, so there is one last type of monopoly, and this one's relatively interesting, and it's, it's an economy of scales monopoly. And I will try and explain this to you in such a fashion that you can get it. It's a little bit weird, but bear with me to some degree. So you guys know from Chapter 6 that economies of scale, if we were to look at a long-run average total cost curve, right, that's this side over here, right? So if we have two companies producing something, suppose they're both producing this much quantity, this is what their average total cost is. If those two companies could merge together and all produce their quantity, 2 times this quantity, so double this quantity out here, so the merged company, what happens to their average costs? Right? They experience economies of scale, which is a good thing, which is something you would think we would all want, right? Again, just using the airline examples a little bit ago, that should point it out to you right here. This is what airlines have been trying to do over the last 3 years. Right? These mergers that have all been happening between all the major airlines is them trying to reduce their costs because they've discovered that their profit is not as high because their costs are too high. And so from a so the goal here is to reduce their costs, and this is how they pitch it to the government, right? They say, we need to merge these two companies because our costs are too high, right? The pilots demand too much money. There's all this insurance because when a plane crashes, guess what happens? Great, I mean, everybody tends to die in a plane accident. So again, there's lots of liability insurance involved in all of that business, right? So if we can merge these two, we can reduce our costs, we can reduce our liability costs, we can reduce our severely high damage insurance payments, et cetera, et cetera. So great, let us all merge. The problem, of course, is that if everybody merged into one company, then what happens? Price is going to skyrocket, supply is going to get restricted, etc. So that almost happened in the airline industry, right? That in fact most of the airline industry would like that. Now, can you think of an industry where there's no competitors for it, but there are, say, individual teams that maybe you watch every Sunday? The NFL. Professional football. Why is there not another National Football League 2. I mean, do you guys know how much money the NFL makes every year? Trillions, folks. Trillions. That's enough. That's all I need to say, okay? Why, if some company is making $1 trillion, is there not another one out there competing with them? Well, the key here is realizing that, and this NFL was, they are smart they're really smart business people. The NFL, when it first came out and it finally started getting profitable, it was a monopoly, right? It was the only place that was sort of organizing and governing professional football. So it's a monopoly. What should the U.S. government do? Well, I mean, or if it doesn't break it up, it should at least regulate it, right? I mean, it should be in there saying this is how much prices should be, this is how much revenue should be allowed, you know, you're going to give you a certain amount of profit, and it shouldn't be trillions, maybe, you know, billions, but maybe not trillions, right? So that would seem reasonable, right? And then a ticket to go to a football game would only be like $5 or $6, which is probably what it maybe should be, instead of, what is it, 80? 120 or something.
It's about 150 to 180.
Trillion. Okay, so and what does the NFL get paid for every game that gets televised on TV? Did you guys read the latest package? Yeah, for ESPN it was 1.2 trillion over 3 years. That's just TV revenue. Think about all the products that people wear that say, you know, Packers, Bears, Colts, Dolphins. Every one of those, NFL gets a piece of. It's a really nice industry. Okay, so the question is, why isn't there another one? Well, the idea is there's one NFL and there's 32 teams. What the NFL did to keep itself from being regulated by the government is that they went in and told the government, look, we're not a monopoly. There's 32 teams. They're competing against each other every week. That's competition. How can you tell us that that's a monopoly, right? I mean, you watched the game last week, right? The score was 14-10. That's a competition. Luckily, they weren't quite that dense, right? I mean, they actually asked them to show that there was a competition between revenue in the two different NFL firms. And that's what they did, right? They pointed out that, look at the Dallas Cowboys. How much revenue do they make? Right? So the Dallas Cowboys by themselves make up like a couple of billion, right? And then compare that to the Green Bay Packers, who make a couple 100,000. And they're competing against each other economically, right? I mean, don't notice the fact that each of those two teams has to take a certain amount of their profit and give it to the NFL. I mean, that's these are not the droids you're looking for, right? And they spun it, though, and it worked. And the U.S. government said, oh, you're right. You're not a monopoly. You guys compete. So the NFL gets to act free of government intervention because it's not a monopoly. The teams compete every week, and they compete at stores everywhere because you can buy a Packers jersey or a Bears jersey or, at Kohl's or wherever else you buy your stuff, right? Perfect. Okay, but the fact remains that at one point in time in the 80s, there was a new football league. Do you guys remember the United States Football League? There's a reason why you don't remember it, because it didn't last too long. It was late 80s, early 90s. It lasted maybe 5 years. Basically, Ross Perot, right? Ross Perot and like 3 or 4 other Texas billionaires, they may have been trillionaires, I don't remember, but they basically created 12 new football teams and made a league to try and they ran their season in the summer instead of the winter so that, people who were starved for the NFL during the summer when they're all resting, right, that they could have football. So what happened was that the USFL came out, right? And this was the average cost for the USFL to manage a team, right? Like a couple of $1 million or, well, $100 million, whatever, right? I mean, don't think about how much they pay football players and how much stadiums cost. Okay. But the key was realizing that the revenues, right, this is sort of the price per team that the NFL was collecting, right? They were making tons of money, right? I mean, this was their profit. So the USFL, when they got in, they weren't making as much profit as the NFL, but notice that they were making profit, right? So what do you think the NFL did? Took them out. The way they took them out is they said, oh, you know those TV revenues that you pay us, which are, right now they're 1.2 trillion. Back in the 80s and 90s, they were only in the billions. They actually took a pay cut. The NFL took a pay cut for 5 years so that the USFL would have to take the same pay cut. They basically said, oh, here's the price per team that we're going to require from TV revenue, from sales of products revenue, from stadium revenue, from teams revenues, etc. Right? So the NFL actually, what it had to do was it had to make this really sweet deal with the teams that the teams didn't have to pay them as much, which is part of why some of the teams are so rich right now. But the goal of the NFL was not to be nice to the teams. Okay, remember, save anybody. Their goal was to kill the USFL. They basically lowered the amount of money that was going to be earned per team to this price, and now what was happening to the USFL per team was money. Ross Perot and his business buddies for 2 years basically lost $100 million a year per team, 12 teams. How long are you going to piss away $1.2 billion per year? Not long. 2 years later, so long USFL. Guess what happened to the NFL about 2 or 3 years later? Now they haven't gotten back to. I mean, honestly, folks, the price that it was costing teams to run is only now getting back to those levels that it was pre-1990s. Just because they literally cut themselves. I mean, they literally chopped the hand off in order to kill the USFL, kill their competition, right? I mean, that was the goal. And again, still, even after that, the government did not step in and say this is a monopoly and that they were practicing, essentially dirty tactics. Don't get me started. It'll drive me insane. But anyways, that was one of the things that led to other types of monopolies, where it's just an economy of scale. There's no reason to create a new football team or a new football league because, one, it's going to cost way the hell too much money. And if you do create one, the guy who's already there making gobs and gobs and gobs of money, he's going to pull out a big old sword and turn you around and stab you in the back. And it's the same in all the other different professional sports, folks. You name it, right? There's only one NHL. There's only one Major League Baseball. Right? Yeah, Well, I mean, what Major League Baseball did, at least, was that when there was competition, like all these minor league teams that exist, they actually buy them. They absorb them. That's the other technique. You either kill them or you absorb them, right? And essentially, that's what the NFL did, because this is when the NFL expanded from 28 teams to 32 teams, because they took the good teams from the USFL and said, oh, this city can handle having a football team? Great. Oh, yeah, we'll move in. Look, there's even a stadium there already. Totally. Oh, it's just awfully great stuff. The both good and terrible levels. But it does point out that monopolies exist, and there's lots of them that are like that floating around. And really, it's all money in the end. All right. I suppose that's probably pretty good. There is a little bit more to Chapter 8, but we can deal with that in Chapter 9 because it's the same thing in Chapter 9. So that is essentially Chapter 8. Homework. Two, 6, 8, and 12. Page 171. Joe, turn me off.